It all started with a letter. Not just any letter, but the kind that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. A bold red stamp across the envelope read, "Notice of Violation." Mark Davis stood frozen on his porch, staring at it as though it were a death sentence. The HOA, an entity most neighbors only half joked about being more dangerous than the IRS, had finally turned its sights on him. He ripped it open, and inside was a fine for $500. The crime? A hairline crack on his driveway, barely visible unless you pressed your nose against the pavement. Mark laughed at first. $500 for that? Absurd. But what he didn't know was that this was only the beginning, the first strike in a war that would test his patience, his sanity, and his willpower to the edge. What came next was relentless. Another fine arrived the very next week, this time for his garbage can being too visible from the street. Then another, claiming his grass was an inch too tall. And then another, this time accusing him of having an unauthorized decorative object in his yard, which was nothing more than a bird bath his late wife had loved. The bird bath made his heart ache every time he looked at it, a reminder of her laughter on summer mornings. To see it labeled as a violation felt like a knife to his chest. Mark started to sense something darker than rules at play. It wasn't about lawn care or aesthetics. It was about control, about crushing him. The fines piled up like bricks, forming a wall around him. Every letter came with threats, escalating fees, liens, even the possibility of foreclosure. Neighbors whispered about how the HOA had destroyed families before. People who had lost their homes over unpaid fines. People who vanished from the neighborhood without a trace. Their houses quickly repainted, their names never spoken again. Mark could feel eyes on him whenever he left his driveway. Was it paranoia? Or were they really watching him? And then came the night he knew something was terribly wrong. At 2 in the morning, he woke to the sound of footsteps on his porch. He rushed to the window, and there, under the pale wash of the street lamp, he saw a shadowy figure crouching near his mailbox. When he flicked the porch light on, the figure bolted, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of footsteps. The next morning, another violation letter appeared in the mailbox, this one marked in bold red. Final warning. The rehook was brutal. They weren't just fining him. They were setting him up for failure. But Mark wasn't about to roll over. He knew he couldn't outpay them, so he had to outthink them. He spent nights in his garage, surrounded by stacks of violation letters, studying the HOA bylaws like a soldier decoding enemy communications. Page by page, he found contradictions, loopholes, and buried clauses that the board themselves had clearly overlooked, or worse, deliberately ignored. It was there, in the tiny print of a forgotten amendment, that he discovered his weapon. According to Section 14, subsection C, any HOA member could petition for an emergency hearing if they believed the board was acting in bad faith or violating its own charter. Even more powerful, fines issued without photographic evidence could be rendered null and void. And not one of his fines had come with a single photo. The realization was electric, a spark of hope in the darkness. But hope was dangerous. He knew he had to play this carefully. So instead of rushing in, he began documenting everything. He set up cameras around his house, recording the comings and goings at night. He gathered every letter, every envelope, every timestamp. And then came the twist that made his blood run cold. One of his cameras caught the HOA president herself, Mrs. Langford, a woman with a smile as sharp as broken glass, sneaking onto his property at night, placing letters directly into his mailbox. Rehook again. They weren't mailing the fines, they were planting them. Mark's hands shook as he replayed the footage. This wasn't about rules at all. This was a personal vendetta. But why him? Why his house? Digging deeper, he uncovered the shocking truth. Mrs. Langford's brother was a developer who had been eyeing his property for months. His lot was larger than most, perfect for subdividing into 2 homes. The HOA wasn't fining him into compliance. They were fining him into foreclosure. They wanted him gone, erased, so they could seize his home and profit off the land. The betrayal ignited something inside him. He filed the petition for an emergency hearing, armed with his mountain of evidence. But he didn't stop there. He leaked the footage anonymously to a local reporter, framing it as a story about HOA corruption. The article went viral almost overnight. HOA president caught planting fines on homeowner S property. The neighborhood was in uproar. Some neighbors who had stayed silent finally spoke out, sharing their own horror stories of harassment and intimidation. The HOA board tried to dismiss it as fabricated nonsense, but the cameras didn't lie. The hearing was chaos. Mrs. Langford sat smugly at the head of the table, flanked by her cronies, but Mark was ready. When he laid out the evidence, every letter, every timestamp, every frame of video, the room turned ice cold. Gasps rippled through the audience. The board's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. And then, the final blow. Mark revealed the buried clause in their own bylaws, Section 14, subsection C. He read it aloud, his voice steady, and when he finished, the silence was deafening. Rehook. The board tried one last desperate move. Mrs. Langford stood, her face pale, and shouted that Mark was a liar, that the evidence was doctored. But at that exact moment, the reporter who had broken the story walked into the room, holding a printed copy of the viral article and confirming that her newsroom had independently verified the footage. The board had no defense. Their empire of fear crumbled in seconds. The emergency vote was unanimous. The fines against Mark were null and void. And in a stunning twist, Mrs. Langford herself was removed from the HOA board effective immediately. But Mark didn't stop there. With the help of the reporter and a few brave neighbors, he filed a civil lawsuit for harassment and fraud. What had started as a war over petty fines turned into a legal battle that made headlines across the state. When the verdict came down months later, Mark not only kept his home, but won a settlement large enough to repair every crack, every blade of grass, every bird bath in his yard 100 times over. And as he stood once again on his porch, looking at the quiet street that had once felt like a prison, he smiled for the first time in months. The HOA had tried to bury him under fines. Instead, he had buried them under their own law. But the final rehook, the one that made viewers lean forward. 1 week later, he received another envelope. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was unmarked. Inside was a single slip of paper with 6 words scrawled in ink. "This isn't tea over. We are watching.